Welcome to Close Looking at a Distance. I'm Kijo Lee, Assistant Director of Academic Affairs at the Cleveland Museum of Art, welcoming you to this interactive guided looking program that promotes sustained attention to works of art in order to expand our understanding of the world and each other. So we're going to start in a moment to give guests some time to log in. But in the meantime, please familiarize yourself with the Q&A interface to the right of your screen, which is basically our communication hub. So I'll have ideas and information to share with you about the photographs we'll be discussing, but I absolutely want to hear from you throughout. You can use the Q&A to post your questions and comments. I'll be following along and reading them out loud. Your responses help me to see where the greatest interest lies and to identify what to focus on next. Remember, when you're commenting, you can include your name or remain anonymous as you prefer. If you take a look in the description area directly beneath the live stream window on your screen, you'll find links to the artworks we show and any other resources we mention. For example, today, in addition to links to the artworks, you'll find a link to information on the exhibition, Bruce Davidson, Brooklyn Gang, links to the 2 articles to which I'll be referring, as well as a link to a Getting to Know You survey that we hope you'll complete at some point during the program. And while the museum is open to the public, distancing dictates that we can't gather together in the galleries for these kinds of conversations, so we've taken that experience virtual. For those who are new to close looking, it's a practice that emphasizes intimacy and care, both in our considerations of the artworks under discussion, as well as in the respect that we offer to each other in our questions and comments. And as we move together from detail to detail and question to question, we collectively pursue meaning. And I'm incredibly grateful that you're taking time out of your busy day to be in dialogue with me. So let's get started. On your screen, you should see a collage of 5 black and white photographs, each depicting a different scene featuring one or several people. In last week's desktop dialogue, Andrew Capetta, photographer Vince Ciani, and curator of photography Barbara Tannenbaum discussed Bruce Davidson's documentary practice in the series Brooklyn Gang, alongside Ciani's socially driven and community-embedded practice. They considered the responsibilities of the photographer to the communities they capture, but they also discussed some of the ideas of manhood, of family, of race, and of emerged in the images and in their interactions with their subjects. And so today we're going to return to Davidson's Brooklyn Gang series and pick up on that thread that connects what we see to the codes of masculinity and race that they may express. What you're seeing on your screen is but a small sampling from this series. Each untitled photograph tells a story, but I'm really curious at the onset of our conversation how you, the audience, might see the people in these images. What story do they tell? I'm going to give you a minute to look, and while I provide a little bit of background, please put your initial thoughts into the Q&A. So we're not going to remain on this collage. We're going to take a closer look at several of these images and see what meaning we draw as we discuss them. But first, I wanted to let you know that this session was inspired by 2 contemporary articles by Norman Mailer. And I'm going to give you a quotation from each to offer a bit of context for our conversation. The first is from his article in Esquire titled, "She Thought the Russians Was Coming," which provided contextualizing text for images found in the Brooklyn Gang series. And Mailer met with them on 3 separate occasions. And in it, he describes the ways that he sees the young men grappling with manhood, adulthood, societal expectations. And in the end, he writes, and I quote, "They suffer from only one disease, the national disease. It is boredom." And he goes, "Well, at least they live out a part of their conversational obsession," he means, with sex, gang war, drugs, weapons, movies. And he continues, "which is more than one can say for the quiet, inhibited, middle-aged desperados of the corporation and the suburb." The second, a 1957 essay in Dissent magazine titled The White Negro, Superficial Reflections on the Hipster, in which he describes the hero of the Beat generation, the hipster. And while it was written 3 years earlier than his more direct response to the Jokers, the essay offers his meditation on how the hipster and hip, or the language and culture of the hipster, came into being. Intrigued by the title, I read the following fascinating evidence, and I quote, "So there was a new breed of adventurers, urban adventurers who drifted out at night looking for action with a black man's code to fit their facts. The hipster had absorbed the existentialist synapses of the Negro, and for practical purposes could be considered a white Negro." And so these conjoined descriptions of the young people pictured in the series, described by our curator of photography as showing the boys exploring their bonding rituals, acting out their visions of masculinity in adulthood, and experiencing lust and love, epitomize the kind of outlaw masculinity to which Mailer was referring. And they offer us an occasion to think about how ideas of masculinity and whiteness can be pictured. I want to take a moment to look at a few of your comments. So Eileen says that the images remind her of West Side Story. Eileen, there is definitely a cinematic quality to these pictures. I'd love to hear more about what you see here that makes you think specifically of West Side Story. It's such a specific aesthetic or way of looking. And then Joanne notes what she's seeing in the images: cars, girls, and cigarettes define their lives, but maybe not in that order. So we don't know in what hierarchy, but we can see some of the trappings, right, of things that are important to them, which might be girls, cars, cigarettes, that figure pretty prominently in these images. And Joanne adds that the Beats had literature. And so, yes, what we are seeing are some depictions of what has been called sort of the Beat generation, and we can talk a little bit more about that later. Says that they're wanting to display a certain reputation or idea of themselves. And I'd love to push that further. So what kind of idea do you think they might be displaying? And maybe to help with that, Antasia says maybe the race to me, so maybe a little bit more about that. Let's move on to looking at a young man in his car, and maybe we can discuss some of these ideas. And Lynn says, hard, I'm thinking hard ass guys. So that kind of hardness, what is it about the cars, the cigarettes, and the girls? How do these images capture the imagination in something like a West Side Story? I would love to hear each of you say a bit more about that, but let's look at this image that we have on our screen at the moment. What we're seeing is and if each of you in the audience might put one adjective that you would use to describe this image. Diane says, proud to show their hardworking personas, work hard, play hard, muscles evident with rolled up sleeves. We'll look at that image in a moment. Strong man persona. And so what we're seeing here is, yes, we see muscles displayed even without a shirt in this image. And we see a young man in the foreground paired with a large white car to his left. And then Joanne, keen eyes, sees in the background a baby carriage that's centered in the background between this young man and the car. Which Joanne says might be the consequences of what, Joanne? We have to be specific. And then Lynn notes that this is of a particular moment, so a 1950s baby carriage. Maybe we can get a bit closer to the carriage just for a moment. Sean or Jeff, whomever is working that component. I'm getting descriptions of single word adjectives. Dirty, yes, look at those hands. just a note to production, I'm not seeing any, we're not getting any closer, any zoom. Perfect, thank you. And if we could, so we're seeing dirty, hard, tough, capable, working class, or grease monkeys in the vernacular of the day. Thanks, Joanne. Not afraid to show their working self. So really on display. So even if we draw a bit closer to, so now we're seeing the baby carriage. So we see that distinctive shape, that sort of bassinet shape with the curved covering, those wheels. So they aren't the kind of wheels that pivot on sort of one of our contemporary baby carriages. If we can pull out and look at the young man, whom I know's name is Jimmy, here at his hands, looking at his full torso. We see pride. Robert says, innocence with a facade of masculinity. I would love to hear more about that, Robert. What do you see that makes you say that there's innocence here? Perhaps it is that baby carriage that others are thinking of as the consequences of what might be happening in that car, and a kind of heightened sexuality is something that does inform, right, this sense of a renegade young man in especially in the 1950s. And so let's see, I see pride, urban, we're seeing these hands. So we see both the grease that is covering his hands and skin, the rag, that he's using to wipe his hands, and so reflecting the work that he must have just been doing on the car. And there's also, I love to look at these works and think about the composition and the beauty of the composition. So that shape that you're noting in the baby carriage is repeated in his muscles. So if we look at the curve of his shoulder and the curve of the front bumper of the car, there's all of these sort of rhyming curves that lead our eye around this composition, but centered in our view are those very dirty hands. Let's see, and I'm wondering about this idea of roughness and toughness. Where do you see that precisely? And Joanne is noting that there's also this, this is right before the 1960s sexual revolution. So this heightened sexuality, I think, even in the sort of way that this young man is depicted, he's obviously good looking, and thinking about West Side Story, these kinds of James Dean characters who do show, right, that they are tough in a display of their muscles, but also in their ability to work mechanical things, to fix things. Let's see. We have Katie noting these different social roles that we see in the objects in the image. So men at work, leaving wife and family at home, work being primary, family being secondary. So maybe even the placement of each of the objects in the image, meaning the figure as one, the car as the other, which are right up front, and then the baby carriage and the home, the building itself, in the farther background. So if we can draw closely into Jimmy's face, please, and look at how he's smoking this cigarette. Joanne thinks he's not actually smoking it. Perhaps it's a prop. But Eileen also wants to think about the set of his mouth. So maybe if we can get a little bit closer to his face. We can see it is difficult to see whether or not it's lit. Maybe it is in a moment in which he will light it or has stamped it out. Antasia notes that there's a heightened sexuality is cool because the car and so thinking about the aesthetic of cool. So that cigarette, which also gets us back to what you were saying, Eileen, about the set of his mouth. There's not a sort of overt smile, right? There's a kind of cock to the head. He's presented to the camera, but sort of looking down. Diane notes it as a composition. They're now finding their eye drawn to the carriage, which is centered between the man and the mechanic, the man and the car. And maybe it's a bit at how he is supporting that family that might be implicated in that baby carriage. And so there is this way that we are getting also a picture of urban life. Can we pull out once more before we move on to another image? Seeing urban life. So we are not seeing a plethora of trees. What we see are tenement buildings, brownstone buildings, a series of cars. So implicating that this street goes a long ways in both directions. Also, this is, to me, the grease of working in a garage rather than perhaps the dirt that you would find on someone working on a farm. And so there are these ways in which, and that's a nice observation, Antasia, that this sort of rhyming in the curves of the body is also maybe a reference to his labor, right? He is also a mechanical being, and where he this sort of in the strata is as a laborer in the fixing of things, not necessarily the designing of that car. And finally, I'll put in one last comment from Robert, who says that when he was referring to the innocence, that the slimness of the stature of this young man is more childlike as opposed to the fullness of a grown man, and that the kind of over-exaggerated display of oil, but does not have control, restraint of experience. So it isn't that this if he were in the engine alone, would he be covered so completely with grease? Is this a kind of performance, right? Even a grit, which I take as part of that toughness and roughness to which others were referring. But also, and in that performance, maybe it is to prove the point that he is, in fact, grown enough, right, for the implications of that baby carriage, but also that he's been beneath this car, that he is a part of its working, and that this kind of that he is rather slender, even though he is muscular. It is not necessarily the sort of developed over time body that we might be accustomed to in an older masculine figure. Thanks so much. I think we should move to the next image, please. So here we see another untitled photograph from the series. And again, I invite you to say what you see when you're looking at this work. And I am going to read from you an excerpt from the 1960 article that Mailer writes about this group of young people. And he talks about how they take up residence in the back of this candy store, this parlor that has 3 booths in the back where they gather. And he says that when they first meet, and I quote, "For the first minute, a bit of tension, nothing all out hostile, more an air of stony curiosity, studied on their part, studied on mine. One cannot get around it. There are situations which belong more to the movies than to life, and all of us were obeying an archetypal scene in a gangster movie or Western. A stranger had come to visit," end quote. So that just gives you a sense of sort of how he was feeling in his initial interactions with these young people in a space like this one. And I'm wondering what you see at work in this image. So Antasia is noting that yes, these seem like younger people as well, also slender. JD says they're sitting very close to each other but looking hostile. There's sort of conflicting body language. Maybe we can draw into that grouping in the back corner and look at that body language and look at who we find there. Thanks, Diane, who notes that body image does change over time, that a slender build was considered manly, as recognized perhaps by ladies around them as what was being seen in the movie. So maybe it wasn't that very large, muscular man that was the vogue at that moment, and that these more slender, wiry, muscular bodies would have been considered manly in that moment. But let's look again at this grouping, that trio. What do you see as you're looking at these three young people? What do you notice about their body language, about their gaze? Who are we seeing sitting here? So someone has noted that the hand, we'll come back to that. I think we'll come back to this one. The hand on the right looks female. I see potential violence. The standing guy looks like he might throw a punch. We'll come back to that one in a moment. But there's different expressions in the trio. That with the leftmost being the most baby-faced. So I'm thinking that the leftmost to your view is the one that's closest to the wall. And then James says that the woman seems owned by the boy in the middle and is in fact a young woman that is closest to the wall here. So even sort of thinking about gender difference and age difference and how to read, even if someone is sort of covering their face, and you can think to yourselves, what are the indicators of gender that we're seeing here? When you say owned by the boy in the middle, what do you see that makes you say that, James? What specifically about how he's sitting gives you an indication of ownership over that young woman? Diane says, in a bid toward romanticism, that she sees them looking into their futures, right? So their gazes are out of the frame of the camera, off in a distance. It's an image that we are used to seeing and reading as contemplative in some way, perhaps of their future. Let's see, Robert says that he first saw boredom. Now he sees them staring off into what? The questions about life, what is our purpose, right? So this also fits into this dialogue around the disillusioned, disaffected youth that sort of permeated speaking about these young people who were not falling in line with society's expectations in particular ways. Lisa says the three in the booth look like they're waiting for something to happen, sort of in this holding pattern. And it's interesting that in both of Mailer's articles, he sort of gestures at the idea that their lives are sort of awaiting for something to happen, punctuated by things like rumbles and thieving and drugs and sex, but a lot of it is waiting for those moments of crescendo. So it's interesting that you're seeing that even in the way that they're seated inside of the shop. So let's see. It's coming in fast and furious. This is really exciting to me. So let's maybe think about. Thank you, Robert. So Robert is saying that maybe that ownership that he was noting in the young man is the way that he's grasping her hand, right? Sort of held up and held, and you can see that his hands is closed around her own. James says that also, though, that his head is tilted toward her, so maybe even in a protective gesture. Many of the men in my family who are quite old school, they always put the women inside a booth and their backs can never be facing the door. Or my mother used to tell me that I only knew that a man was dateable if he sort of put me on the inside of the pavement as we were walking down the street. I should never be street side. So these kinds of gendered codes about what are the means of protection that a man should offer a woman in a relationship. Thanks, Joanne, who says, yes, before Betty Friedan set them free. Um, so, thinking also, if we pull out, Joanne is noting the sort of hairstyles that these young men have. Something called a ducktail, which I admit I am not sure what that is. But also, there was a way in which this kind of rolling of the sleeves, we see this sunglasses inside, smoking cigarettes. Again, we have this cigarette that is emerging from a young man's mouth. And if we can draw in a little bit closer to behind that young man, what do we see? And while we're looking at that little close-up, I want to read another quotation from Mailer, and he says that in such places, this is from the 1960 article in which he's talking about this group. He says, in such places, excuse me, I apologize. This is from the 1957 article called The White Negro. He says, in such places as Greenwich Village, a menage a trois was completed. The bohemian and the juvenile delinquent came face to face with the Negro, and the hipster was a fact in American life. If marijuana was the wedding ring, the child was the language of hip, for its argot gave expression to abstract states of feeling which all could share, at least all who were hip. And in this wedding of the white and the black, it was the Negro who brought the cultural dowry. Any Negro who wishes to live must live with danger from his first day, and no experience can ever be casual to him. No Negro can saunter down a street with any real certainty that violence will not visit him on his walk. And he goes on to talk about the kind of cameos, the performances of security that are maybe the purview of white society are lost to the Negro and, in effect, lost to the hipster. And so we can see this kind of idea of a living in the present, this waiting for something to happen right now, that he's seeing sort of embedded in this group of young people. Lynn knows that there were his pants are without a belt, which was common for a hard guy in this era. So none of the sort of trimmings, right, of preppiness, where belts would be worn, things would be very carefully tucked, sleeves would not be rolled in the way that his was. Let's see. So we're seeing in that Coca-Cola poster another depiction of a man and a woman. Diane says, also showing this sort of protective man holding a woman, though the smiles in the advertising are contradictory to the lack of smiles, right? So it's kind of this funhouse mirror, right, of that relationship. If these young people are defining themselves against this sort of scrubbed up version, this more respectable version, right, of interaction, then we can see that very boldly in the contrast between the couple in the corner and the couple here, but also maybe in the young man and his cigarette and the man that's pictured clinking his Coca-Cola with the girl. Let's see. So someone was saying that Coke is displaying, an image of the good life. And I'm wondering what about that image says the good life? What specifically? So Maria says that she's currently reading The Outsiders with her son, and so many things about how the boys are dressed and their stances are reflected in the book. And so, right, these are these sort of young, though still good, but having rough childhoods, not necessarily going to school, not sort of fitting into the societal mores. But what we learn about in The Outsiders is their camaraderie, right? This sort of development of a group identity, but even as it's starting to split apart as they're getting older and becoming different people. And so I think that, someone is saying that, yeah, these young people are not necessarily looking at that image in the Coca-Cola ad as something to emulate, but perhaps something to reject, something to define themselves against. And so, I return to this idea that Mailer noted earlier, that what they're functioning against is the idea of what he calls the middle-aged desperados of the corporation, and thinking about the differences in advertising, or what sort of young people that Parler was hoping to attract with that their Coca-Cola ad. And I think, let's see. Oh, and someone's wondering what the other image is that is taped on the wall behind his head. And I am not certain what that might be. But I mean, I think that what we are starting to build, right, is, again, we have this vision of a sort of muscular, though slender young man, not looking directly at the camera. There is a particular sort of confrontation in his turning his chest toward us, that these two sort of ideas and I think particularly about white masculinity. So we are not seeing any ostensibly dark complected or black phenotypically people in this particular image, though they do exist in other images from the series. We are seeing this sort of buttoned up. The gentleman in the man in the Coca-Cola ad has a collar on his shirt, buttons, hair also done but differently, not the ducktail, I would imagine, and the very sparkling young woman, teeth, looking at him adoringly. And then we have this young man in the foreground, as someone mentioned, perhaps ready to punch, in motion. We have this blur that he is moving in some direction, smoking a cigarette, and not as engaged with what he looks like, but not engaged with the camera in the same way, as we can say that drawing is imitating in the ad. So the sunglasses indoor, yes, indicating this sort of too cool for schoolness. Let me see. Diane says, if they believed in fairy tales, the poster might be aspirational, but it's like sort of looking at Hollywood today. And so I think that we should actually take a look at the next image, because we've talked a little bit about young women as they're appearing as they appear in this particular image. But this, I think, will offer us a lot to think about in terms of the relationships between young men and women that these images might be displaying, but as well about the rebel nature of the young people that he was capturing. Thank you. So our curator, Barbara Tannenbaum, adds that the other poster that was in that image shows a very stylized cowboy tossing a lasso and has the words "always hits it." And the bottom has the word ice. So probably another drink ad. Thanks, Barbara. So now that we're looking at this untitled image that shows a young woman standing with her hands in her hair in front of a cigarette machine that has a mirrored sign that says cigarettes, with a young man to her left rolling up his sleeves. We also have in the middle ground on the right, two figures that seem to be walking into a bathroom or some other doorway. And then to the left behind the young man, we have a young woman who in shorts and a short sleeve top holding a purse, walking behind. And we see in the very, very foreground, almost pushed up against the lens, the silhouette of in profile of a person. What else are you all noticing? So James says that maybe this figure, the young man, isn't rolling isn't just rolling up his sleeve. He's rolling up a pack of cigarettes into his sleeve. James says this pic looks so 60s. What do you see that makes you say it looks so 60s? We also have oh, thanks, Tiziana, who notes that it looks like there's a it looks like a photo booth in the middle ground as well. So there might be a photo booth that exists behind where this cigarette machine lives here. Thank you for that. There's maybe a phone booth that might be there. I do know that there are bathrooms, but there aren't any mirrors in there. Thank you, Barbara, for that background information. And so James is noting the styles and the hair is making them seem very 1960s. When I look at this young woman in this image, I can't help but think of Brigitte Bardot, the sort of full hair. The woman in the back right, thanks Katie, looks like she's wearing a swimsuit. Absolutely. This was a place to go swimming. So interesting, Diane notes that the cigarette machine is beneath the sign that says no smoking. Exactly, right? So a built-in rebellion, I guess, right into the space. How were they meant to resist? Then also noting that, so what we're seeing, if we focus on the young woman, what are you seeing? So Joanne notes that her top is fairly revealing. We see her torso on the side through that little split where she's raised her arm above her head. What else are you noticing about that young woman who's standing in front of the cigarette machine? Yes, the no smoking sign. Someone's noting the short shorts on the young woman behind the cigarette stand. So Robert notes there's a free-flowing quality to the youth as opposed to the constrained quality of the seemingly older women on the right. So I'd love to hear more about why you think the women on the right are old. Their hair is shorter cropped, her hair is long, and she seems to be flipping it here and there. The sort of casualness of her jeans with that semi-revealing top. So maybe this is, a youthful distinction. But how do we know that she's young? What do you see that makes you say that she's young? It seems to be that she's primping her hair. She's not exactly smiling. Can we zoom in a bit on her face in the mirror? Perfect. Thank you. How would you describe the look on her face? Right? She seems to be looking into the mirror, but by doing so is sort of meeting our gaze too, perhaps. And, one of the things is that this is one of the best known images from the series. And just to give you a little bit of more context, this is taken at Coney Island. And it shows, and I can give you, so self-admiring. Thank you, James. Diane says she also looks like she's making a sex star pose. I would love to hear what you see that makes you say, specifically like someone who would have been like an it girl or a sex star. What does that mean? And I can say that, Mailer, for his part, wrote that he's sorry. He is as sorry as the reader that he could not, for example, he would not be able to tell us anything about the girl who's fixing her hair. And he writes, and I quote, "Let it go. That was summer, and this is a thin little report on life in winter." But we do actually know a bit more about her, which is why I'm challenging you all to think about what you see when you're looking. So N says very young, enjoying being with a good-looking guy. So sort of enjoying that she is linked with the young man that we see. Diane says that the guy is ignoring her efforts. So though she's making it for others. Oh, wow. I can't believe it's already 5 minutes to close. Thanks, Hannah. So what we are we have this tie that is right below her bosom, perhaps to accentuate it. Absolutely. And as you can see, as we are moving toward the close of our experience, what I was hoping you might be able to note is all of the ways, and you have been, the ways that they are both falling into and out of typical codes of what's youthful. And we often think of rebellion as a youthful quality, right? But also the codes of masculinity that they are playing with. So this display of one's dexterity, as we saw with our mechanic, this display of a sort of devil may care attitude in smoking, in hanging out in candy stores in groups that are not necessarily the groups that that store would have been after. And if we can go to our last image, the hugging, yes, thank you. There are also these images of these that are both improper in their display of sexuality, but really sweet in the entanglement of these young bodies as they are exploring each other. But what I want to just note before we go, because as you're reading the Norman Mailer pieces, especially the White Negro, there were rejoinders to this way of describing the racial undertones of these works. And so James Baldwin, and the two were only a year apart in age and had been friendly rivals prior to the publication of The White Negro. He writes, Baldwin writes, and I quote, "But why should it be necessary to borrow the depression language of deprived Negroes, which eventually evolved into jive and bop talk, in order to justify such a grim system of delusions? Why malign the sorely menaced sexuality of Negroes in order to justify the white man's own sexual panic?" For Mailer writes quite a bit about Black men's sexuality in that longer piece. And about Mailer, he wrote after their friendship collapsed, "The great gap between Norman's state and my own had a terrible effect on our relationship, for it inevitably connected, not to say collided, with that myth of the sexuality of Negroes, which Norman, like so many others, refuses to give up." So what he was talking about are the sort of stakes, the material stakes that they were both occupying that caused this sort of difference. And I leave you with Robert saying, "Hugging, they're making out." Yes, they are, Robert. A distance was made possible in part by the National Endowment for the Humanities, and the next program will take place on Wednesday, November 11th at noon, at which I hope to see you. And now my colleague Andrew Capetta will tell you about the next desktop dialogue.
Hey, thanks, Keisha. That was a really great, really wonderful conversation. I have two things to talk about really briefly. First, I want to remind everyone that tonight we have a program called Identity, Experience, and Contemporary Latinx Printmaking, which features contemporary artists Fidencio Fifield Perez, Jaylee Garcia, and Michael Menchaca. They're going to discuss how they use printmaking to express their identity and experiences as Latinx. And so tickets are free and available at cma.org. Just go to our webpage, and on the homepage you can go get a ticket to get the program link. And then next week's desktop dialogue, Healing Through Abstraction, we're going to have visual artist Hernez Davis, whose work is currently on view at Transformer Station. And Hernez is going to discuss her abstract photo-based images, installations, and weavings, which she describes as surfaces for expression, meditation, anger, rest, and quiet spaces of self-care. Some things I think that are on a lot of our minds right now. And we're also going to take a look at some works in the collection that have inspired her, or artists that have inspired her, like Sam Gilliam, Mark Rothko, and Lorna Simpson. So that's next Wednesday at November 4th at noon. We'd love to see you there.
Thanks so much, Andrew. And if you'd like to explore these works in our collection, there's a link to the collections online in the description, as well as all of the other links that that we described at the beginning of our session. Please remember to complete our Getting to Know You survey. They help us frame our programs in the future. Thanks, everyone. Have a fantastic afternoon.